Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Pooler. My guest today is my two dear friends, Diane Sare and Scott Ritter. And we're going to talk about Daniel Ellsberg. And, Daniel Ellsberg was a hero ever since he, ousted the Pentagon Papers. So which one of you want to start and talk about the importance of Daniel Ellsberg?
I will yield to Diane.
Okay.
Well, I'll be very brief because Scott actually knew the man personally, which I did not have the privilege of doing, but I thought it was very appropriate to be discussing him this week because apparently June 29th was the day that Mike Gravel read the Pentagon Papers into the congressional record. So its timing is highly appropriate. And also, of course, Mike Gravel just passed away, I guess, in the last year or two, very recently. And Ellsberg was the source of this. And if you look at what Ellsberg was doing in his later years with his concern for what was happening with Ed Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, you see, I think, a terrible shift in the United States, that the Pentagon Papers ended up actually being published in the New York Times. Mm-hmm. And the people were able to act, although Kennedy was assassinated. President Kennedy had been assassinated prior to that, and we know that he intended to get our troops out of Vietnam. But I think what you see is the potential for the nation to respond to a person of great courage. Because with the background that Daniel Ellsberg had, and as I said, Scott will know more and can say more, he didn't have to do any of this. He didn't have to risk his life. He was an economist. He was a veteran. He was working for the Rand Corporation. He was not someone who had to necessarily worry about his future, and he was willing to stake his entire existence and his life on preventing a horrible disaster from befalling the United States and the world, and from the deaths of potentially millions of people. And I think it's very important that we reflect on that and that we consider what he would be doing were he young and vigorous today.
The reason why I contacted Scott to do a show about Ellsberg is Scott's very courageous. He's risking everything to speak out and do what he's doing. So I thought it would be appropriate for Scott to talk about Ellsberg. Scott, what's your view?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you very much, but that's like comparing a weekend hacker with Jack Nicklaus.
No, it isn't.
Daniel Ellsberg is the Jack Nicklaus of the anti-war movement and of speaking truth to power. I had the honor and privilege of meeting him, collaborating with him on several projects, and I am. It's one of the highlights of my life that. I always talk about, making sure that you have good transcripts. Not everybody's good at TV, because people can get up there like me and I have a lot of hums and ahs, and some people freeze and they don't do well. But the power of your words, the transcripts are what history is going to judge you by, reading the words and the weight of the words. And Daniel Ellsberg has a plethora of words out there, written words, spoken words, transcripts that are his legacy. And it's a very proud thing for me that included in these transcripts are comments that Daniel Ellsberg made about me and the work. And I'm just overwhelmed with the fact that this man of such stature thought highly of the things that I was trying to do. But why wouldn't he? It's not because of me. It's because of what we were trying to do, the common objective of avoiding a war that didn't need to be fought, confronting the lies of a government that was out of touch with the real needs, the genuine needs of the people. how the security state uses fear to intimidate and compel people into accepting as normal the taking of human life by the U.S. government through the vehicle of wars, declared and otherwise. So, yeah, I'm humbled and almost embarrassed to have my name used in the same breath
come
as
on.
I would say this, you know, if the United States was half the nation we should be, Congress should be issuing a gold medal in honor of Daniel Ellsberg, and the President of the United States, having failed to honor him with the Presidential Medal of Freedom while he lived, would be giving it to his family posthumously. Daniel Ellsberg is deserving of the highest awards that our nation can put on him. But the wonderful thing about this is that even though we know, unfortunately, at least in the foreseeable future, that he will not be so honored by the government, that's okay, because Daniel Ellsberg was working against the policies of the government. Daniel Ellsberg needs to be rewarded by the American people, and we can only do this now on reflection of what his life meant, what his words defined. And to ensure that we live up to this, that we respect the legacy of his life's work, that we breathe life into his words. Bring these transcripts to life. Don't just sit here and be people that read the words of Daniel Ellsberg and say, what a wise man, what a smart man, what a genius man. What we should do is be reading these words and saying, how can I emulate this man in what I do today? How can I carry forth his legacy and make it a living legacy? Because otherwise his words have no meaning. He is a man who articulated against war, a man who articulated against lies. And we have struggles today that require men and women of the stature, Daniel Ellsberg, to take a step forward and say, I will follow through with what he wanted. Diane Sare is one such person. You, Cynthia, are one such person. I try to be one such person. And we need an army of people willing to say, we are Daniel Ellsberg, that he lives in us today. And that's the best way to honor the memory of this man, this great man. I have to tell you, I'm a little disturbed, though, to see how almost immediately after his death, to watch the peace movement collapse into a redefinition of Daniel Ellsberg, using his words for their own meaning. Did he mean this? Did he mean that? Did he mean this? And the thing is, we won't know because, of course, he's dead, so we can't ask him. But again, fall back on the transcripts. Listen to what he said. Let those words be your guide. Don't reinterpret them for your own personal ambition, your own personal use, your own political, desires. We should be united in the cause of peace, united in the cause of preventing wars, united in the cause of speaking truth to power. We have causes out there that are deserving of somebody like Daniel Ellsberg. For instance, we have Julian Assange in prison in England, getting ready to be extradited to the United States, where he faces the prospects of losing his life in an American prison cell. We have others out there who have spoken truth to power. We have Edward Snowden in a permanent exile because his country will not consider the gift he gave us by exposing constitutional violations. He should be given a Presidential Medal of Freedom, not condemned to a life of exile. Daniel Ellsberg, again, we should look at it. What Edward Snowden did was every bit as courageous as what Daniel Ellsberg did. We should be seen that way. Daniel Ellsberg should become our guide. He's not alive today to lead us, but his words can guide us, and we should do everything we can to bring his legacy into our hearts and allow that to motivate us as we move forward, hopefully on a journey of peace.
So, Scott, what made him decide to go public in the New York Times with the Pentagon Papers? What was the deciding factor? Do you know?
Well, I when you say, do I know, knowledge implies absolutes. I've spoken with Daniel Ellsberg. He has spoken on this topic. I've spoken to people who know him, and I think the motivation was that the lies were that were being told by the government were so blatant, and the consequences of these lies were so bloody, and that he had lost hope in the government fixing itself. I mean, the Pentagon Papers is a history of America's involvement in Vietnam, an official history, but it was a secret history. And in it, it clearly says what we're doing today is a lie, based on a lie. And one would expect in a government of the people, by the people, for the people, founded on the principles of the rule of law, where lies should not be tolerated, that the government would seek to heal itself, even if it wanted to do so in secret. But that's not what was happening. The government was ignoring the truth and acting on the lies. And I think Daniel Ellsberg, in a desperate move, because it was an act of desperation, it was a huge act of desperation, he got the truth to the American people. He put it out there at great risk. And I think he felt that fundamentally, if America was to survive as the nation it claimed to be, it had to address the stain of the Vietnam legacy, the stain of the war. The government wasn't going to solve this. In fact, by continuing to lie about this, not only did it push us further into conflict, but it further separated the United States of America as it existed with the promise and the potential of America as it was formed. And the gap that was being created there was not going to be bridged. It was going to be too great, and America would stop being America. Now, when I put it this way, what do people join the military to die for? Because when you join the military, you're basically giving your life to the government. You're saying, this is me, I am a tool, I am giving myself to you, and you are allowed to use me as you see fit in the defense of the nation. And sometimes that use requires death, the sacrifice of those who have offered themselves to their country. Daniel Ellsberg had offered himself to his country. He had joined the Marines. He had served in heroic capacity, both in uniform and out. And he is looking at the country heading in the wrong direction, towards its destruction. This is a man who is willing to give his life for his country while wearing a uniform or in an official capacity. But the definition of an American citizen isn't to sit back and say, I hope he or she sacrifices their life on my behalf. The definition of an American citizen is to say, I am willing to make that sacrifice, save country I love. And Daniel Ellsberg, the citizen, did what he had to do to save the nation. And he put his life on the line, and people should understand that. The decision he's made, there was no guarantee that newspapers were going to publish this. In fact, one knows that there was deep struggles within the newspapers about publishing this. There was no guarantee that the American people would receive this information and act. Congress would act on this, that this war could end. There were no guarantees. In fact, the overwhelming body of data suggested that Daniel Ellsberg would act, he would be arrested, he would be imprisoned, and spend the rest of his days in life as a traitor to his nation. But he did it anyways, because that's what citizens do. Real citizens, people who love their country, are willing to put it all on the line in defense of their country. Daniel Ellsberg put everything on the line. Fortunately for all of us, and people need to understand this too, he was going to go to jail. There was no doubt that Daniel Ellsberg was going to jail because he broke the law. He violated the law. He shattered the law. And the legal system was going to come down on him like a ton of bricks and crush him. But the government, this corrupt entity, the American government, couldn't handle that. They had to destroy him because they understood that even if they legally confined him, contained him, locked him away, his actions had exposed the lies of the government, exposed the truth. So they needed to destroy the messenger, and that's what governments do best. They destroy messengers. And Daniel Ellsberg had his psychiatrist broken into. and by the government. And that act, that additional criminality on the part of the government led the judge to say, we're done with this prosecution. And they dismissed it, not on the merits of what Daniel Ellsberg was doing or trying to achieve, but on the corruption of the government. And it was dismissed and he was allowed to walk free. Daniel Ellsberg is very fortunate, but I think sometimes people look at this and say, if you do the right thing, you will pay no price. No, Daniel Ellsberg got lucky. Daniel Ellsberg was ready, prepared to pay the ultimate price. They said, why did you do this? Do you not fear going to jail? And he said, would you not go to prison to stop this unjust war? Would you not sacrifice everything to stop the war, which is destroying what your country supposedly stands for? And Daniel Ellsberg was willing to go to jail, to sacrifice everything. And I think people don't understand the scope and scale of what was at stake at that time, because he didn't go to jail. He was able to live a long and very productive, very fruitful life. And we look at the totality of his legacy and we forget the immediacy of the moment, the fear that had to exist in his gut as he walked up those stairs, knowing he was headed to certain incarceration in a federal penitentiary system that treats people of his class very poorly. So you cannot diminish the courage of Daniel Ellsberg. You cannot diminish the sacrifice he was prepared to make. It must be understood by all, because only if you understand that will you fully comprehend what Daniel Ellsberg accomplished in his long and notable life.
Diane?
Well, I wanted to bring up something that he did very recently, which is to release another trove of documents from the Rand Corporation about war with China. And he said at the time that he challenged them to arrest him because, again, he was breaking the law, and he hoped that the word would be magnified by some controversy, which is that there was discussion of a nuclear war with China over Taiwan in 1958. That was the policy, that crazy people in our Pentagon and State Department and elsewhere were prepared to unleash a nuclear war. Taiwan would end up being nothing but a piece of nuclear radioactive waste. Eisenhower prevented that, but Ellsberg raised the legitimate question, is that the policy today? And I think we have to raise that question, and we should do it more forcefully now in the wake of his death, because that was his last trove of papers delivered to the public. I think it demonstrates how insane our government is. And also, I heard something recently which rings partly true. I don't think it's the only reason, but I can't remember where I heard it. I think it was an interview with someone by our friends at the Duran about the peace process, or maybe it was somewhere else, in that they attempted in Ukraine, where Zelensky and Putin, they were ready. The documents we now know from Putin were already initialed in terms of the agreements to end the war last March, April of 2022. And the US and the UK, Boris Johnson famously flew over there on a cargo jet big enough to hold his fat ego, and sabotaged it. And the reason being, or why the Americans said that they couldn't allow this peace process to go through, is that we had to send a message to China. Now, I don't think that's the whole reason, because I think they want to destroy Russia as well, but they certainly would want to send a message to China. And we see this now, the continuing provocations and escalation. And I think we should not, this latest release of papers that Ellsberg did was only November of 2021. The New York Times published them.
So the newspapers today are kind of like rubber stamps for the government. We have the internet, we have, Jimmy Dore and Clayton Morris, and to a lesser extent me, to name a few. could could something be written in the New York Times today that would criticize the government that it did back in the 70s? Scott?
Oh, I think that the New York Times, let's be frank, it has to maintain the facade of being a journalistic outlet. So if conditions arose where something became so obvious, painfully obvious, that was happening, the New York Times would have to report upon it, or otherwise it would just be dismissed as what it should be dismissed as, a little more than a stenographic record of the policies of the United States as expressed by unnamed sources that come from the government of the United States. That's what the New York Times and the Washington Post are today. But no, I do believe that if something is so painfully obvious to the American public that, and this is why I believe that, I oftentimes mock the American people as sheep. I will continue to do so until they prove me wrong. But there are many Americans out there who aren't sheep, many Americans who are hungry for facts, hungry for knowledge. They watch your podcasts, they watch other people's podcasts, and we shouldn't be dismissive of Jimmy Dore's audience or anybody's audience online, because first of all, let's just be frank, Jimmy Dore has a larger audience than CNN has. I can write an article on my Substack, and if it hits the right moment, more people will read it than any article written in the New York Times. So there's a new reality out there the New York Times has to contend with. It understands increasingly that it's competing with outlets that are challenging the narrative, and therefore the New York Times, when it's safe to do so, and that's the important part, the New York Times only takes these steps when it's safe to do so. When the government itself has said, hey, we gotta go ahead and encourage a debate about this because we need to win the public over, so we're going to take control of the debate. And that's the motivation of the New York Times. It's never to actually engage in a critical discussion. It's to take control of a discussion that's already occurring in your space, Cynthia. I can guarantee you that people like yourself are ahead of the curve when it comes to challenging the narrative. And the New York Times is never leading, it's always following. It's taking control of things that people like you start to spin it in a direction that's acceptable to its primary client, the United States government. So yes, the New York Times is capable of putting out critical pieces, but we have to understand their motivation. It's not to inform the public. It's to shape perceptions to shape public perception in a way that meets the needs, wants, and demands of their principal client, which isn't the American people, but rather the American government.
Diane, it's that bewitching hour and you have to go. So do you have any final thoughts?
A couple. I mean, one, I do have to say, in terms of my own background, having been associated with another American genius, LaRouche, who was blackballed and spent time in federal prison and had all of his publications shut down and had associates who went to prison. I'm not unfamiliar with the kind of attacks. Scott has had his share of attacks from this operation to silence people who would tell the truth. And I agree with his assessment. It actually, the people have more power than we use. We can force the media simply because they will be seen as being completely absurd if they don't cover things that we know to be true. And I think that we're at a moment where we have a very short fuse. And if you and Scott are going to continue to discuss the situation with Russia, I think the recent events create an increased risk for miscalculation on the part of the West. Because the problem with the lunatics in the West is they tend to believe their own stupid narratives. they make them up and then they believe them, and that causes them to make terrible miscalculations. And coming back to the Daniel Ellsberg point, I think that's why his work was so very valuable, because if our nation is to be what it was intended as a bulwark against the British imperialist system, then we have to have a commitment to principles of truth, and we have to have a government that is worthy of the consent of the governed. So those are my closing thoughts, and I'm really glad that I could be here with both of you, and I'm eagerly going to watch the rest of this later.
Thank you. Scott, you've got to go soon, but I want to talk about Russia. So we'll come back in a few minutes.
Okay.
Okay.